Shannon, you listened to that. Let's first talk about the nuclear power executive orders that he signed. What is the goal here for the Trump administration when it comes to the nuclear power industry?
I think one of the big things that this administration has raised concern about is whether the U.S. is going to have enough energy to power this sort of AI revolution that's going on, these huge data centers, all the computing that's needed for the U.S. to really keep and maintain its lead in AI. For that, you need electricity. Now, in the early days of this administration, we saw them putting regulations on other forms of energy, particularly clean energy like wind and solar, putting restrictions on it there. Now you see the administration shifting more towards nuclear energy, limiting restrictions and regulations to try and speed the development of new nuclear energy facilities. And that was the real intention of these executive orders today, the president said.
And we heard from some of the business leaders that were in the room with him as well, Shannon. And they said the fact that the industry was so heavily regulated, it really stood in the way of innovation and expansion. Would the goal here be to break down some of those walls to speed up some of those long-term goals?
Right. I mean, one of the executives used an example that he said his company had where they're trying to just put a new reactor in a facility that already has an old reactor. And he said they had to go through $1 million long, lengthy process to prove that that was a good site for a nuclear reactor, even though they already had one there. So we saw this during Trump's first term, this sort of effort to take down regulations in order to sort of speed development, whether it's infrastructure development or whether it's something here like nuclear energy. And again, you're kind of seeing those similar themes play out here.
But there's a risk associated with that, though, right, Shannon? I mean, there's a purpose that these regulations were put in place to begin with, and obviously there's an advantage to nuclear power in that it's clean burning, but of course there's issues with the infrastructure related to nuclear power, and then of course the waste that comes from nuclear power. Isn't part of why these regulations are in place is to try and make sure that it doesn't do further harm to the environment?
Well, yeah, I mean, typically when there's a regulation somewhere, it's there for a reason, and maybe companies can argue that it's not a good reason anymore, or it's drifted away from the initial purpose of that regulation. But, you know, these regulations usually all come from somewhere, and, 50 years ago, at least, we know that, there were a lot of safety concerns about not only nuclear safety, communities raising concerns about wanting to have them, and then, of course, the disposal of that nuclear waste. None of these regulations necessarily are unwinding any sort of safety regulations. It's more, the administration is saying, of sort of speeding up and streamlining a process, so not changing the process, not taking away anything they have to do, but just kind of trying to find ways to make it quicker. Obviously, time will only tell whether that happens because there's other things that can lengthen these processes. But the administration saying they're trying to respond to this need for energy by just at least speeding up the process that's already in place.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.